Winter. Poland, 1259. The wind moves across a dead land, whispering through the bones of men on hosses frozen, where they fell. In the fields, peasants pass silently by the biddies of invaders, still mounted, turned to ice, as if time itself refused to bury them. Ravens circle above, black stains and a white sky. For 20 years, Europe had dreamed of these men, the horsemen from the east, the storm that devoured kingdoms. They were fear itself, born of endless steppe on fire. But fear changes shape, did it can turn to hatred. And hatred, left to burn long enough, becomes something worse. When the Golden Horde returned that winter, they didn't find armies waiting in the plains, nor knights shining beneath banners. They found silence and a country that had erased itself. The wells were poisoned, the grass was gin, even the graves were empty. What the Mongols didn't know was that Europe had been watching, learning. And in learning, it had changed. This would not be a battle between good and evil. It would be something called a deeper. A world learning that to destroy the monsters at its gates, it must become one itself. The snow will drink what the sod can't, the land will remember, and the age of fear is about to end, not with mercy, but with imitation. If history teaches anything, it's this: every victory demands a part of your soul. Stay with us and see how Europe paid its price in blood and silence. Before the snows of 1259, Europe had already been broken once. 18 years earlier, in 1241, the Mongols came like a judgment from the sky. They crossed rivers still frozen with spring ice, burned cities whose names no one dared speak, and erased kingdoms as if they had never existed. They were not merely an army, they were a system. An empire without borders, forged by discipline sharper than steel and fear colder than reason. The horses moved faster than messages. Their arrows darkened the sun. And their memory lingered like smoke in the lungs of every survivor. In the towns of Poland, Hungary, and Bohemia, children grew up in stories of riders who never missed, of camps that vanished before dawn, of cities where the sky turned red for a week. Entire generations learned one lesson: you could not fight the Mongols. You could only survive them. Europe, divided and proud, had never seen unity. Kings quarreled over crowns while monasteries prayed for mercy that never came. The Mongols were the mirror they didn't want to face, proof that order and brutality could coexist, that the world could be kinked not by faith, but by calculation. Yet empires writ from the edges. When the Mongols withdrew east after their great invasion, they left behind more than ashes. They left a question: what happens when the monsters are gone? But the fear remains. The survivors began to study. They watched the riders' tactics, their speed, their precision. But more importantly, they studied themselves, the weakness that had made them prey. And slowly, in the quiet decades that followed, something in Europe hardened. Farmers learned to fight like wolves. Blacksmiths began to forge tools that could serve as weapons. Monks recorded knit prayers, but maps of the invaders' paths, their seasons, their habits. Even silence became strategy. By the time the Golden Horde returned in 1259, Europe was no longer the same. It had been baptized in fire. The lands that once trembled now watched the horizon with cold patience. And at the heart of this change stood one man, Duke Boleslaw the Chaste. His title spoke of purity, but his heart carried 20 years of memory. He had seen the Mongols burn his people alive. He had buried children turned to ash. And he had vowed that if they came again, he would make the land itself their executioner. This time, Europe would not meet the storm head-on. It would become the storm. In the east, the Golden Horde prepared as it always had, confident, efficient, unstoppable. 30,000 riders, born in the saddle, guided by centuries of conquest. They expected terror. What awaited them was patience, the quiet cruelty of a people who had learned to wait. The steppe had created warriors, but Europe had created something new. Knit heroes, knit saints, survivors. And in that survival, a different kind of darkness was growing. The Mongol army crossed the Vistula River in the last days of December. They came as they always did, with banners of black silk and hooves that made the frozen ground tremble. But this time, the land did not welcome them. The air was heavy with smoke and silence. Every mile they rode, the world seemed to decay a little more. Villages stood empty, doors torn open, hearths still cold. The wells were filled with dead animals. The fields were scorched black. Even the wind smelled of ash. For men who had spent their lives riding through Conquest, this emptiness was unbearable. The Hossis snorted uneasily. Ravens followed them in flux, feeding in the carcasses left behind. The Mongols called it a cursed land. Their general, Noyan Noikhan, believed it was only fear. He was wrong. Weeks before they came, Duke Bolslaw had turned his entire country into a weapon. His people had vanished into forests on mountains, taking their food, their animals, even their ancestors' bones. He ordered every well poisoned, every blade of grass burned, every road erased. He left behind only death. The land itself had become a trap, designed not for a single battle, but for slow destruction. The Mongols depended on their horses more than on their weapons. A warrior without a horse was nothing. Each carried 10 mounts, drinking the blood for strength, living on dying with them. So the Poles struck at the one thing the Mongols could not replace. They left behind mares infected with a hidden disease that spread like wildfire through the herds. Soon the mighty horses began to cough blood. They stumbled, fevered on blind, the biddies shaking in the cold. The disease leapt from one to another, invisible and unsteppable. When the first horses fell, the Mongols killed the sick to protect the healthy. But in doing so, they spread the infection with their own blades. Within weeks, half the herds were gone. The army slowed. And in the silence of that still winter, the second stage began. The Poles did not face the Mongols in open combat. They struck like shadows. At night, peasants moved through the forest barefoot, guided by moonlight and snow. They found the Mongol camps, cut the throats of their horses, and disappeared without a sound. In the morning, the invaders woke surrounded by death. The ground around them was red ice. The horses lay in circles, their eyes frozen open. The message was clear: you are not the hunters here. You are the prey. Fear began to spread through the Mongol ranks faster than disease. They heard whispers at night, footsteps in the trees, church bells far in the distance that rang without hands. They began to see ghosts in the fog. Exhaustion set in. The riders who once swept across continents now stumbled through forests, where even the trees seemed to hate them. Then came the poisoned gifts. Barrels of mead, sacks of grain, dried meat abandoned in the snow. Hunger forced them to take it. Soon their bellies burned, the skin turned pale, their minds swam in fever. They started killing each other for clean water that no longer existed. From the shadows, Polish peasants watched them collapse. These were not soldiers in shining armor. They were men who had waited 20 years for this moment. Men who had lost their homes, their children, their faith, and replaced it all with one thing: revenge. Each day the Mongols advanced a little farther into nothing. Each night, more of them vanished. The land itself had swallowed them whole. When Noyan looked across the white fields, he did not see an enemy. He saw a grave. And deep inside, he began to understand the truth. He had not invaded Poland. He had ridden into a lesson. By midwinter, the Mongol army was no longer an army. It was a procession of ghosts moving through smoke and hunger. The sound of hooves had faded into coughing, the clash of steel into the whisper of dying horses. For weeks they had chased the Polish duke across a landscape that refused to live. Every village they entered was a tomb, every fire a trap, every meal a slow poison. Yet pride drove them forward. They believed one decisive battle would end the torment. They were right, but not in the way they imagined. When Duke Bolslaw reached the plains near Sandomierz, he stopped running. For 2 months he had prepared this ground. Beneath the snow lay trenches, hidden pits, unsharpened stakes coved from oak and smeared with rut to make every wound a death sentence. To the Mongols, the field looked perfect for the kind of open battle they loved. The Duke arranged his army in the old European style, knights in shining armor at the front, infantry behind them, banners bright against the pale sky. It was a painting of predictability. When the Mongol scouts reported the sight, Noyan smiled for the first time in weeks. Finally, he thought, the enemy had lost his nerve. He ordered his cavalry to perform the old dance, the feigned retreat, the move that had destroyed 100 European armies. The first wave of Mongol horsemen advanced, loosing arrows in the familiar rhythm of death, then turned as if in fear. But when they looked back, expecting a desperate charge of knights, they saw nothing. The Poles did not move. They stood still, shields locked, silent as statues. Confusion rippled through the Mongol lines. Then came the sound no Mongol had ever heard in a battlefield before, the cracking of bones beneath the snow. The Hossis stumbled first. Their hooves broke through the thin white crust into trenches filled with stakes. Screams filled the cold air as riders were thrown, impaled, crushed. The Mongols tried to retreat, but the field was a labyrinth of death. Their formation broke. And that was when the crossbowmen revealed themselves from the tree line. They aimed not at the men but at the Hossis, methodical and precise, cutting down the last strength of the hard-won mount at a time. Panic took hold. The greatest cavalrymen in history found themselves in foot, trapped in frozen mud, their arrows useless, the pride shattered. Then the earth began to move. From behind the ridges came the peasants, thousands of them. They were net warriors, net knights, but men of the soil armed with the tools of harvest, scythes, flails, hammers. Their faces were covered with cloth to block the stench of death. They moved as one tide, slow and relentless. The Mongols tried to form defensive rings as they had in the east, but their strength was gone. The field became a storm of biddies on steel. The sound was not the clash of armies, but the grinding of labor, a rhythm older than war itself. For every Mongol that fell, another peasant stepped forward. They fought not for glory but for memory, for the children burned 20 years before, for the villages erased from the map. The snow turned red and then black as day faded. By nightfall, the once invincible warriors of the steppe lay scattered across the field they had believed would bring them victory. Their general was taken alive, bound, and paraded through the same villages his men had burned decades earlier. He was not executed by the sword. His punishment was slower, more symbolic. The Duke wanted him to see what he had created, a people who no longer knew the difference between vengeance and survival. Word of the slaughter spread across Europe faster than any messenger could carry. At Kresenbrunn in Austria, the Bohemian king adopted the new strategy. He no longer feared the Mongol cavalry. He met them with walls of pikes and armor so thick that arrows broke against it. The Mongols, masters of movement, were crushed by stillness. They had taught Europe speed and precision, but Europe had learned patience and endurance. When the last Mongol horse fell, the world shifted. The hunters of empires became the hunted of villages. The steppe, endless and free, was no match for a continent that had turned its fear into discipline. The silence after battle was not peace. It was transformation. The survivors tried to flee eastward, into the mountains. But there, too, the land was against them. The passes were blocked, the rivers frozen, the forests waiting. Those who escaped the sword met the winter. Those who escaped the winter met hunger. Some turned on each other. Others vanished into snowdrifts that would not melt for months. When spring came, the peasants found them, not as kinkers but as reminders. Their weapons were gathered, their armor melted down into plows. The war had fed the earth again. In the churches that rose in those battlefields, the walls were built with the dust of bones. In their prayers, the priests no longer asked for deliverance from the Mongols. They asked forgiveness for what they had become. Because something had changed forever. The lesson had been learned too well. The invincible riders of the steppe had taught Europe how to fight without mercy. And Europe, once a continent of kingdoms and faith, had discovered something more enduring than either. It had discovered efficiency. The Duke stood over the field long after the cries had faded. Snow fell again, covering everything. The same wind that once carried fear from the east now carried silence. He understood then that victory was not triumph. It was inheritance, the passing of darkness from one hand to another. In that moment, the world turned. The age of Mongol terror was over. But the age that replaced it would be colder still. When the spring thaw came, the fields of Poland bloomed again. Grass rose where the dead had fallen, and rivers carried away the ashes of both conquerors on the Kinkad. Europe was safe. The nightmare had ended. But something had changed beneath the soil, something no one could see. The land remembered. Across the villages, people built churches in the ruins of battle. The stones were mixed with the dust of bones. The walls were cold to the touch, as if they still held whispers of what had happened there. Inside, the bells rang each dawn not to call for peace, but to remind the living that peace had a price. For the first time in memory, Europe no longer feared the riders from the east. The sound of hooves no longer made children hide. Yet the victory felt hollow. The people had learned to win not by faith, but by imitation. They had fought monsters by becoming their reflection. And in that reflection, something of their own humanity had faded. Historians would later call it the birth of a new Europe, Strenga, united, relentless. But the peasants who survived called it something else. They called it the winter that never ended. Because after Sandamias on Kresenbrunn, mercy grew rare. The methods used to stop the Mongols were used again, and neighbors, and heretics, and rivals. The knowledge of cruelty could not be unlearned. It became part of Europe's armor, invisible yet permanent. Centuries would pass. The names would fade. The bones would turn to dust. But the lesson remained. Even the purest cause can leave shadows behind. A continent had saved itself. But in saving itself, it had learned the oldest truth of all. No one defeats darkness without carrying a piece of it home. History does not ask for our judgment. It asks for our understanding. The story of how Europe destroyed the Mongols is not only about victory. It is about the moment when survival became transformation, when fear turned into something colder than war itself. If stories like this remind you that courage and cruelty often walk the same path, stay with us. There are more echoes waiting in the past, stories of faith, of empire, of the fragile line between light and darkness. Subscribe and journey with us into history's forgotten truth that every triumph leaves a shadow.